Once people settled down and began farming, civilization as we know it began. That was our first mistake. It kicked off a set of problems that continue to plague us today. You see, some people have more than others. Most of the time that's just a fact of life, but on occasions this imbalance can lead to violence. When that violence is combined with racist beliefs, the results can be catastrophic. This week we're going to tell you the story of Chinese immigrants who came to the United States to find a better life, then lost everything. Immigration and opportunity. Most of those who immigrated to the United States during the 19th century were from European countries. But they weren't the only ones looking for freedom and opportunity. Chinese immigrants began arriving in the United States as early as 1815. At first, the arrivals from China were all men, and they were usually sailors. For several decades, the Chinese-American population remained steady at only a little over 300. But this all changed when the California Gold Rush began. In 1848, James W. Marshall discovered gold in Coloma, California. The following year, a mass of humanity started pouring into the area, hoping to make themselves wealthy. Before it was done, over 300,000 people would arrive. The Chinese also wanted a chance to earn their fortune. Over 40,000 of them arrived in California during the gold rush. But only a few years after it began, the promise of riches disappeared. By 1860, it looked like most of the accessible gold deposits were exhausted. Just like their white counterparts, Chinese immigrants had to find other ways to earn a living when the prospect of finding gold vanished. Many of them did as previous Chinese in America had done. They worked in mines, plantations, and fisheries. The United States began constructing railroads across the continent. This task required a large labor force. There simply weren't enough white workers to meet the demand, so the companies that were responsible for building this infrastructure began using Chinese labor. The Chinese immigrants that lived in the United States had a much different experience than those of European descent. Because the Chinese looked and behaved differently than Europeans, they were often subjected to rude and racist behavior. This resulted in Chinese immigrants clustering into exclusive communities, which in turn made the problem worse. New arrivals from China were surrounded by others from their own country. There was little need to learn English, so many of the immigrants never bothered speaking anything but their native language, and most of them didn't intend to stay as long as they eventually did. The way Chinese men looked was also a problem for many white residents. The laborers that arrived in the United States still had families back home in China. They returned home to visit as often as possible. The law in China required men to maintain a certain type of grooming standard. This required wearing a specific type of clothing and shaving the front of the head. If Chinese men did not maintain this standard, they would not be allowed back into China. But maintaining this strange appearance was also another source of division. The racial tensions didn't explode into violence at first, but by the late 1870s, railroad construction was almost over. The economic boom that had driven growth for decades was at an end, and jobs were no longer easy to find. Popular opinion in the following decade turned sharply against these new arrivals from Asia. As racist opinions dominated the halls of government, a new law was passed to help enforce those beliefs. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prohibited more arrivals from that country. Of course, thousands of Chinese were already in the United States, and now the men could not go home, or they wouldn't be allowed to return. Working conditions were also very dangerous in the 19th century. In some places, like Wyoming, white miners began striking. The owners of these companies realized that Chinese immigrants would do the work just as well for less pay. The racial and economic tensions would soon reach a boiling point. Opportunity knocks. Before 1870, there were no Chinese living in Rock Springs, Wyoming. The population was almost entirely composed of European immigrants, except for some African Americans who fled the South. Most of them made their living in the nearby coal mines. Starting in 1870, the Union Pacific Railroad arrived. So did Chinese laborers. Many of them began to settle in Wyoming, and several found their way to Rock Springs. They experienced hostility almost immediately upon arrival. But there was no violence. The new arrivals were not worried. In 1875, the white coal miners grew tired of being exploited. They worked hard in dangerous conditions for little pay. Finally, they had enough and went on strike. Less than 2 weeks later, coal mining resumed. Chinese miners were brought in from other areas to do the work. They worked for less than the white miners and were just as productive. The striking miners began to hate all Chinese people. From their perspective, these immigrants were stealing jobs and driving down wages. The two groups didn't like each other, but they also remained separate. In 1881, the white miners established a part of Rock Springs where only white people were allowed, and Chinese immigrants lived in their own closed communities. There was animosity, but violence wasn't common yet. The situation began to deteriorate in August 1885. Notices were posted all over Rock Springs demanding that Chinese immigrants should be expelled. The miners were in favor of that idea. On September 1st, the white miners held a meeting to discuss the Chinese immigrant problem. Before the night was over, several members of the Chinese community would begin receiving death threats. It looked like the racial tension that had been simmering for over a decade would finally explode. Massacre. On September 2nd, at 7 a.m., 10 white men showed up at the mines. They said that since miners were paid by the ton, the Chinese had no right to work in the most productive areas. The miners agreed and attacked 2 Chinese miners who were working nearby. One of the men later died from his injuries. Work suddenly stopped at the mines. Men began leaving and poured into the town of Rock Springs. They met and debated what to do about these unwanted immigrants. Around 2 p.m., 150 men armed with Winchester rifles began moving towards the Chinese settlements. There were only 2 paths into the community, so they separated into 2 groups and covered both directions. The armed group sent a party ahead to warn the Chinese. The immigrants were told that they had 1 hour to pack up and leave, or else. Only 30 minutes later, the white miners began firing. 2 Chinese coal miners were the first victims. The group of vigilantes broke into squads. 2 remained behind to kill any Chinese who tried to escape. The others moved further into the settlements looking for Chinese victims. The Chinese residents heard about the mob and knew that 2 of their own had already been killed. By this point, they were more than willing to leave. They began fleeing in every direction, but the paths were blocked. Some of the Chinese survivors eventually made their way to New York and told their stories to a Chinese ambassador. Here is one such account. Whenever the mob met a Chinese, they stopped him and, pointing a weapon at him, asked him if he had any revolver, and then, approaching him, they searched his person, robbing him of his watch or any gold or silver that he might have about him, before letting him go. Some of the rioters would let a Chinese go after depriving him of all his gold and silver, while another Chinese would be beaten with the butt ends of the weapons before being let go. Some of the rioters, when they could not stop a Chinese, would shoot him dead on the spot and then search and rob him. Some would overtake a Chinese, throw him down, and search and rob him before they would let him go. Some of the rioters would not fire their weapons, but would only use the butt ends to beat the Chinese with. Some would not beat a Chinese, but rob him of whatever he had and let him go, yelling to him to go quickly. Some who took no part, either in beating or robbing the Chinese, stood by, shouting loudly and laughing and clapping their hands. For the Chinese who did not survive, the experience was much, much worse. The eradication effort continued into the night. As the evening progressed, miners began setting Chinese homes on fire. If they found someone alive in the house, they might kill the person first before setting it on fire. Sometimes they just threw the still living person into the flames. For some of those who died in the fires, the terror and pain must have been unimaginable. Several victims were found in their cellars. They tried to dig holes in the dirt to hide in. but the fire moved too quickly and engulfed the lower half of their bodies. These unfortunate victims died while being cooked from the waist down. The violence unleashed on the Chinese victims was extreme. In addition to being burned, they were scalped, branded, decapitated, and hanged. This brutal event would shock the nation, and eventually the entire world. Consequences. The Chinese who survived the massacre made their way to the town of Evanston, Wyoming. It was about 100 miles away from Rock Springs. After arriving, the Chinese began receiving death threats again. Local newspapers around the Rock Springs area were in support of the massacre. The rest of Wyoming did not share their enthusiasm. On September 3rd, the territorial governor, Francis E. Warren, visited Rock Springs to see things for himself. When Warren reached Evanston, he knew more violence was possible. He sent a telegram to President Grover Cleveland requesting military assistance. 2 U.S. Army companies arrived 2 days later. On September 9th, the U.S. Army escorted the surviving Chinese immigrants back to Rock Springs. Their community was nothing but ashes, and many of the dead had been left to rot instead of being buried. In late September, the white miners went on strike again in protest of the company using Chinese labor. It did not have an effect this time. Eventually, the white miners had no choice but to work alongside the Chinese that they hated. 16 men were arrested for the massacre. They were taken to jail and held until a grand jury could review the case. A month later, all the men walked free. The grand jury gave the following reason for not charging them. "We have diligently inquired into the occurrence at Rock Springs. Though we have examined a large number of witnesses, no one has been able to testify to a single criminal act committed by any known white person that day." The violence had impacts far beyond Wyoming. Newspapers all around the country condemned the massacre. As news spread to the rest of the world, the general reaction was anger against those who started the violence. The United States government did not bother apologizing to the Chinese government. This nearly caused a diplomatic disaster. One governor in China publicly suggested that Americans in that country should expect retaliation for the events at Rock Springs. American diplomats saw anti-American attitudes rising all over China and Hong Kong, and British newspapers were also encouraging the Chinese to strike back for those who were killed. Eventually, American diplomats convinced Grover Cleveland that if he didn't do something, trade with China would be affected. The United States never admitted fault for the event, but they did pay restitution to China for the property that was destroyed. In 1886, $147,748 was paid to the Chinese government, which is roughly equivalent to $2.9 million today. The Rock Springs Massacre was the most violent event experienced by Chinese immigrants, but it wasn't the last. More violence was unleashed upon laborers in Washington and Oregon in 1886. Eventually, the violence did stop. Chinese immigrants were not allowed to enter the United States again until 1943. The Rock Springs Massacre was a tragedy in every way possible, and nobody was ever held responsible. What do you think about this horrible event? Which part of it bothers you the most? Do you think it could happen again today? We've spent this whole episode telling you what we think. Now we'd like to know your thoughts. Also, it would be great if you hit the like button, subscribe to our channel if you want to see more stories like this in the future, and we also have a Patreon page if you're into giving. And if you want to go to our website, you can even purchase a Bad Things in History t-shirt. The links are in the video description. Thank you for watching Bad Things in History.